I'd like to thank Dr. Allida Black for coming tonight. She's going to share perspectives on Eleanor Roosevelt's call to action. I'd also like to especially thank Shirley and Bern Hendel for creating this endowed chair, which has been such an important opportunity for DCC since 2003. Many thanks to the DCC Foundation for their support to make this event possible. I have the pleasure of co-chairing the Women's Activities Committee with Dr. Tina Araka, who teaches in the English and Humanities Department. Tina, please come to the stage and add your words of welcome and introduction.
Here I am. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this special program. I, too, want to extend my gratitude to two very special friends of the college, Shirley and Bern Hendel, for establishing the endowed faculty chair. It brings prominent scholars to our campus, enriching the college community and well beyond. I also want to thank Diana Pollard and the Dutchess College Community College Foundation for her excellent work and for helping organize tonight's event. A special thank you to Dr. Ellen Gambino, our Vice President of Academic Affairs and Student Services, President Pamela Eddington, and to my dear colleague and friend, Professor Susan Conrad, for bringing this event to fruition. We are honored to have Dr. Allida Black with us this evening. Dr. Black is a research professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University, where she also serves as editor emeritus, advisory board chair of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers, a project she designed to preserve, teach, and apply Eleanor Roosevelt's writings and discussions of human rights and democratic politics. She is the managing director of the Allenswood Group, a collaborative she founded to empower individuals and strengthen democracy through education and civic engagement. In 2010, she served as executive director of the FDR For Freedoms Digital Initiative, a web-based education program dedicated to the four freedoms: freedom from fear and want, and freedom of speech and worship. She has written and edited 10 books, as well as a variety of articles on women, politics, and human rights policy, and has led workshops around the world on human rights, conflict resolution, and women and girls empowerment. In 2009, she conceptualized and led the Courage to Lead, a symposium of 100 women leaders from 50 post-conflict nations for the U.S. Department of State and the UN High Commission for Human Rights. Dr. Black has also curated human rights exhibits for the United Nations, the Four Freedoms Park, the National Park Service, and the National Archives, and has managed women's programs for the National Democratic Institute and advised numerous documentaries produced for public television and other cable channels. She is a trustee of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and a director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights, the Kilimanjaro Center for Community Ophthalmology, the Liberian Education Trust, the Women's Campaign School at Yale, and the Women's Leadership Forum of the Democratic National Committee. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Allida Black, tonight's Hendel Endowed Chair Lecturer.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. God, I hate to hear myself introduced like that. I think they should just say, hey, this is Allida and she does Eleanor. But I'm very glad to see you all. I love Dutchess. I taught here 25 years ago, and I cannot tell you the gratitude that I had for that job when I was a starving graduate student working on my dissertation up the road at the library. And so it taught me a lot. I mean, I taught in Greenhaven Maximum Security Facility for Dutchess. I taught on this campus. I taught at Dutchess South. I started doing my first distance learning here. So I have great affection for Dutchess. And you should know that I talk about you all over the world. So just so you'll know, I just wanted you to know that. So when Tina and Susan reached out to me to say, will you come talk about Eleanor at Dutchess, it took me maybe half a nanosecond to say yes. And then we had a great conversation on what do you want me to talk about. And so they thought that the most energizing and evocative and hopefully intellectually challenging way to deal with this is to talk about Eleanor's call for us to risk our lives for democracy. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. I want you to listen to that first sentence. Risk our lives for democracy. That does not mean sitting in our butts in a theater in a great community college. It means risking our reputations, risking our incomes, risking our physical safety, as well of those of people that we love, to build a country that is worthy of our dreams. Because as Eleanor lay dying up the road here, she stayed alive to finish this book. I believe that with all I am. It is her manifesto. It is her call to action. It's entitled Tomorrow is Now. And with the exception of this quote, and a quote that I will use when we talk about Eleanor and the war, everything comes out of Eleanor's last attempt to have a conversation with the American people. And so why did we call this staying aloof is not a solution? Eleanor knew she was dying when she wrote that sentence. She endured dangerously high fevers. She was bleeding from the back of the throat. She could not handle a knife and fork, nor could she write. She whispered across a table like this to a woman, trying to get Eleanor Denniston to hear her voice for her final call to action. So why did she press herself so hard to urge us not to stay aloof? She already had an incredibly voluminous legacy by the summer of 1962. She had written almost 30 books, 550 articles. Her nationally syndicated column, My Day, appeared in newspapers from 1936 on, leaving us more than 8,250 opinion pieces that she wrote on life, politics, hope, and the fate of the world. Ladies' Home Journal, and McCall's Magazine carried her monthly question and answer column for 21 years, leaving more than 250 advice columns to read. She could have dedicated her last energies to spending with family and friends. Instead, she stayed alive to finish this book. Why? Because as she told Eleanor Denniston before she died, I have something I want terribly to say. So what did she say? Eleanor believed that America's greatness rested on the power of its ideas, not upon its economic and military might. And before you all think you can zone out because she's an intellectual, she's not. She had 4 years of school. If you are in Dutchess, you already have 3 times the education by definition that Eleanor Roosevelt had. She learned this from her experience through all of the major crises of the 20th century. The Gilded Age, World War I, the collapse of progressivism in the 20s, the Great Depression, World War II, the emergence of the Cold War. She lived through Holocaust camps and internment centers, squalid refugee conditions in New York City. She was the first American who was non-military to walk through the Holocaust camps. She was the only American non-military to, in fact, go through the refugee camps. She was the first American to go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs were dropped. She met with young people whose skin still stunk so much from radiation that after she left them, she vomited outside the hospital. She had 17 assassination attempts on her life. I'm not talking threats. I'm talking people tried to kill her. The Ku Klux Klan placed the largest bounty in its history on her head. But she refused Secret Service, and she drove herself through the Klan to go to Monteagle, Tennessee, to lead a workshop on how to do nonviolent civil disobedience in order to integrate northern and southern businesses and schools and neighborhoods. So much so that she had to put a loaded pistol on the front seat of the car as she drove herself up an unlit macadamized road, a blacktop road in central Tennessee, going from Nashville up into the mountains. She did this because she believed in our fundamental decency. But she had very little patience with us when we succumbed to what she would call the politics of fear. She said in the late 50s, as she began to die, we reel from the atomic bomb. We have an escalating Cold War. We have rapid social, technological, and economic change. Sound familiar? Anybody want to put terrorism in? Anybody want to put trade wars in? Anybody want to put in a wall across a border in this? Anybody want to look at how the automation of work is taking jobs and requiring new skills? Vast social change? New neighbors? New types of marriage? It's the exact same principle. What did she say? She said, the world awaits America to provide a dynamic example of drive. But to ER's immense frustrations, America was sliding downhill at the exact time that the world needed it to stand up. The nation had abandoned curiosity, had sidelined diplomacy, and had accepted an outlook governed by fear rather than boldness. It had forgotten that it could set its own course and make its own history. Its citizens, us, had forgotten the history we had already made. Not the dry dates and policies that filled textbooks and encyclopedias and pop quizzes, but the daring imagination, the conviction, the guts, the boldness that inspired our revolution against tyranny and slavery, and our continuing chafing at the bond that bigotry imposed on American society. In short, Eleanor argued in this book, America couldn't lead because it wasn't ready to lead. And why weren't we ready to lead? We had to learn to think in new ways. We had to abandon fear. We had to abandon an us versus them political polarization, whether it was communism versus democracy, Republicans versus Democrats, Catholics versus Protestants, Protestants versus Jews. Americans might be told over and over that they stood on the shoulders of giants. But until we understood that the giants were like us, that they weren't just Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Kennedy and Betsy Ross and Harriet Tubman and Lincoln. It was the people of the United States who had made the country great. And until we learned to incorporate that, as long as we detached ourselves from that, we would cede control of our hopes and our fears, and democracy would die. So Eleanor decided that the number one thing that she had to do was to stand with Americans who risked all they had to make their dreams real. And so what I'd like to do is to talk about how she did that in 2 or 3 areas, and then the impact that it had, not just on the United States, but the world, and the impact that it is still having, alas, more in the world than it is in the United States. I will argue that Eleanor Roosevelt was the most significant woman of the 20th century, and not because she was married to Franklin Roosevelt, not because she was First Lady of the United States, but because she was a fierce civic activist who, once she understood how to build community and had the courage to continually re-examine and challenge herself, she gave voice to all of the issues that we are debating right now, from national health insurance to the living wage to immigration to intermarriage to religious freedom to the purpose of community colleges to the environment to international trade to global interdependence, and especially to the collapse of America's and Americans' civic engagement. It is a sin in this country. It is an abomination in this country that people do not vote. And Eleanor would be standing here right now, going up and down every row with her hand out saying, "Hey, Mary Moody, I'm Eleanor Roosevelt. Are you registered to vote?" Thank you. She did that everywhere she went. She registered voters in the South. She raised more money for voter fraud and voting rights and poll tax abolishment than any person in the history of the United States, with the exception of Duke Ellington, who was the most famous African-American musician of his day. So how can we unpack Eleanor from this really sweet woman and that brass statue in the courtyard of the FDR Library? You know, I mean, that's a great picture of them. It shows the sculpture's based on a picture. And they're happy together and they're working. But Eleanor did not sit still. I just want you to hold one thing in your mind before I start walking you through some stuff. There were 17 attempts on her life. The Klan put dynamite under trees where she spoke. They tried to shoot her. They put dynamite around the axles of her tires. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, thought she was so outspoken on race that he wanted to convene a secret meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee, strip her of her citizenship, declare her colored, his word, and ship her to Liberia and declare her a communist, because only a communist could be so committed. This is a far cry from the incredibly polite, dignified, and gracious image that we have of Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was dignified. She was gracious. But she was gutsy as hell. And the line here is that to be effective, you don't have to change who you are. You must be true to yourself. And so how did she learn this? And then how did she work in 3 arenas about this? And what is the legacy for us today? Is this okay with you guys? You want me to talk about something else? You're so quiet. Is it all right? Okay. So she had a great teacher. And her teacher's name was Marie Souvest. And, you know, Eleanor had a really crappy childhood. I mean, there's just no other word for it. Her father was a drunk and a junkie. Her mother was a cold, heartless word that rhymes with witch. And, you know, who told her that she was her greatest disappointment. She was going to grow up and, you know, be alone and end her life locked in an attic by herself because nobody would love her. So it takes her a long time to learn to read and write. Her grammar is always atrocious. But she finally gets to go to school when she's 14. And she's at a small finishing school in London, which is now the site of where the women's Wimbledon final is. You know, so when I see Venus and Serena and other extraordinary women, you know, with muscles ripping, I think of Eleanor's mind going back and forth in that thing. Because why do I say this? Mademoiselle Souvest taught her the single most important thing of her life. And that is, you can never know what you think until you can argue the position of your fiercest critic with equal intensity. In my case, that means I have to listen to Kellyanne Conway. I'm not strong enough to do Bannon yet, but I read him religiously. Okay, why? Because she understood how to make both sides of the argument, so she could pivot. This will be of enormous value to her in the White House. It will be of extraordinary value to her at the United Nations. And by the end of her life, when she is siding very much with young people who are trying to make democracy real, she can go in and talk about and have conversations with their dreams and their aspirations without saying, why do you want it? I don't get it. So I just want you to hold that. And if you don't remember anything, I want you to try to do this for a week. She did it every day. So let's see how it helped her. I think there are 3 issues that we can do fairly rapidly that will show her progress and that will set up her call to action. The first is immigration. It was the first thing that Eleanor was really exposed to. I mean, she didn't want to go home from school. She wanted to stay with Mademoiselle Sylvestre. And she says, of course you can stay with me. You can spend the summers with me. But you have to learn to be independent. You have to learn to make our itinerary, set the budget for it, and most importantly of all, remember when you are in a different community or a different nation, you are a guest. And so you can shop, you can go to the opera, you can go to, the theater, all you want. But you've got to learn to speak the language, and you've got to volunteer and give back. And so when Eleanor is 15, 16, and 17, she's working in the settlement houses in London and Paris and Austria. People who are fleeing Asia. People who are fleeing Northern Africa to try to figure out how to start their life on again. So she's learning a little bit of Russian. She's learning a little bit of Czech. She will become fluent in German, Werner. And she will continue this until 1962 when she is trying to learn basic Swahili to have a conversation with African diplomats who are coming up to see her from the UN. So she has always, from her most formative years, been engaged in conversations. So when she comes back to the United States, which she doesn't really want to do, she wants to stay and teach in London, but her uncle is president of the United States, her family's putting pressure on her to make a debut. She comes home begrudgingly. She does it, and she begins to work in the settlement houses in New York. But proper America takes over. She forgets the boldness that she saw in Europe. And she comes back and she thinks, oh, well, if we can put a picture on a wall, that'll make people feel better. But that doesn't last very long. And you begin to see Eleanor dealing with deaths and famine and workplace injuries. She is working with Russian, Jewish, and Czech garment workers in New York. They speak very little English. They're working 12, 14, 17 hours a day, or their kids go in and work 8 to 14 hours a day, and they are, in some cases, bound literally to the pedals of the machine. She carries excrement and body waste up and down the steps. She's beginning to see that there's a very different America. She has seen the complexity of white New York. Now she's beginning to see the complexity of immigrant New York. And so she begins to become very involved in campaigns for the living wage, for maximum hour day, for maximum hour work days, for the minimum wage as a living wage, for health care, for education, for civic communities. This is her education platform. This is where she takes labor. In fact, FDR will say it is Eleanor who takes him to labor. And who will she take? Rose Schneiderman, Maud Schwartz, and Sidney Hillman, the three most powerful labor leaders in New York, all of whom are Russian Jewish immigrants. They will be her lifelong friends. Eleanor will carry immigration with her until 1962 when she dies. It is a major theme in her life. And it will surface again with refugees when we talk about the war and we talk about the Declaration. But what Eleanor is very comfortable with is people of different palates, different languages, different education levels, different cultural patterns, but people who are committed to work and want to build a family. That's what she takes into the White House. That is why she can help FDR remain a political figure after polio strikes him in 1921. It is Eleanor who is across the state, not FDR. After 1921, they will never spend more than 6 months a year together for the rest of their marriage until 1945. Because she has found people who have courage, who laugh, who give her a new vision. So let's jump ahead to the White House years. And let's look at 2 issues during the White House. Let's look at race and let's look at internment. Eleanor was clueless on race until she got into the White House. Clueless. She knew very few African American people. She had met Mary McLeod Bethune, the great educator, but they would not become friends until the White House. When she begins to travel on her own, driving her own car without Secret Service protection, and trying to figure out for herself whether the New Deal programs were working, she begins to see America that is not New York. She goes to the South. She goes to the West. She goes to the Pacific Coast. And she begins to see the stigma that is there. She's aware, but she's uncomfortable with it because she'd been uncomfortable with the segregation at Warm Springs, which is where FDR went in the 20s and the 30s to try to rehabilitate his very paralyzed legs. But she had made no African American friends. In 1935, she had already begun to speak out on race, but something happened that radicalizes her. A man had been brutally lynched. I don't mean strung up with a rope. I mean tied to a spit and roasted on a fire. Before that, he was forced to cut off each digit of his thumb. People then cut off his toes. He was castrated. He was put on a spit and roasted. And then he was hung from a tree, and there was a picnic. And we had families in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes and standing around posing with the body. We know this because Walter White, who was then the executive director of the NAACP, very skinned African-American man, could pass. He risked his life over the 3 days that it took Claude Neal to die, because they took him from Georgia to Florida to Alabama. And he hid a camera under his arm, and he photographed the end of Claude Neal's death. He took this to Eleanor, and Eleanor became a switch flipped. Sure, we have Huey Long and his radical populism in Louisiana, but it was Claude Neal's murder that showed her the depth of fear and hate. And so she begins to become more outspoken on the issues of race. She argues for equal schools. She argues for integrated schools. She defends interracial marriage, but she's incredibly frustrated by not being able to get the anti-lynching bill passed. And FDR refuses to put it on his must list of legislation. And so what does Eleanor do? She goes into the gallery of the Senate, where she sits for almost 5 days. 5 days. She doesn't change her clothes. She doesn't go home to sleep. She leaves to go to the bathroom. And when people ask her what she's doing, she says, "I am bearing witness." We are all on trial to show what democracy means. The death threats on her escalate. By 1939, Eleanor Roosevelt has already invited Marian Anderson, the African-American contralto, the most famous American vocalist in the world, to perform at the White House and to bring her mother. The Daughters of the American Revolution say, you know, you can't sing there. You're black. We have a standing order of not renting the auditorium to African American artists. Oh, by the way, yes, 6 years ago we did have an African American troupe, but they performed in blackface. And you're not doing that, so we're not going to do it. Did you all hear what I just said? An African American troupe. Do you know what blackface is? It's like boot. It's like black boot polish. And so Eleanor resigns from the Daughters of the American Revolution. She uses her nationally syndicated newspaper column to do it. It becomes front page in 483 newspapers in all the contiguous states. And it stays on the front page from February 27th, 1931 until February 27th, 1939 until April 11th, 1939. She knew what she was doing. She had never used her newspaper column up until that point for a political issue. But she writes this: I have been debating an issue in my mind for quite some time now. And that is, if you belong to an organization and that organization takes a position of which you disapprove, should you resign? And she says, usually I've stayed and tried to win people over and bring us together. In this case, it is an organization in which I take no active part, therefore I am resigning. Marian Anderson now, the bigotry and the segregation that she encounters in Washington, the nation's capital, was left in the nation's capital until Eleanor wrote that. And Eleanor made it a national issue of a challenge to segregation. She says, why curse Hitler and support Jim Crow? She says, hearing Marian Anderson sing Schubert's Ave Maria is like sitting in the lap of God. She is going public. The year before that, she has gone to Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia to set up the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, being one of two whites and a group of African American leaders who are raising money and challenging the federal government and state governments for hospitals, textbooks, to enforce violent crimes, to prosecute people who commit violent crime. She has walked in to Birmingham, Alabama, the home of Bull Connor, of the riots on the attack on the children in Birmingham in 1963, when Dr. King authorized the Children's March. He was still getting started in Birmingham 25 years earlier, and Eleanor comes in, trucking down a hallway, an aisle, to come in to lead this conversation on abolishing the poll tax, on registering African Americans to vote, on abolishing the literacy clause. And she comes in and she plops down right next to her friend, the African American educator, Mary McLeod Bethune. Bull Connor comes over to her and says, "This is a segregated county. You cannot do this." Eleanor asks one of the janitors to get her a chair, and she puts it right in the middle and straddles both lines and looks at him and basically says, "Come get me, honey." And he doesn't do it. Word is spreading through the South like wildfire. There are rumors of Eleanor clubs where she's going around and organizing all the African American women who worked as maids, to demand more wages. The death threats on her escalate. She will have the largest FBI file in history prior to the assassination of Malcolm X. And 98% of it, almost 99%, relates to race. Let's go to the war. I already said, why curse Hitler and support Jim Crow? The war, Eleanor tells her great friend Truda Lash, fills her with the greatest sense of responsibility that she dreads she will never be able to discharge. She tells FDR, the lesson of World War I is that we won the war, but we lost the peace. FDR meaning that we didn't do anything at home to help us go forward. When in 1943, when FDR says, "Say goodbye to Dr. New Deal and hello to Dr. Win the War," Eleanor holds her own press conference an hour and 28 minutes later and says, "I, for one, will not put the New Deal away in lavender." They are publicly fighting about American social policy. So Eleanor had been very instrumental in helping African Americans get jobs in the defense industry. Why? Because she uses the Marian Anderson concert with FDR. 75,000 people came to see Marian Anderson sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial Easter Sunday in 1939. It was the largest crowd in the history of Washington. It was larger than the crowd that greeted Charles Lindbergh after he was the first person in the history of aviation to fly to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And she basically says to FDR, after he sends Eleanor to go meet with the organizing committee, "Franklin, there were 75,000 people here for a concert. You will have 250,000 people here for jobs." And so as we begin to hire African Americans in the defense industries, and African Americans register in record numbers to fight in the Second World War, Eleanor sees segregation raised its head again. First, with African American WACs. Second, with the Tuskegee Airmen. And third, in Detroit in 1943. There was a housing project in Detroit that was built for defense workers because they're staying in Detroit in the winter in tents in snow. I want you to think about this. Pup tents in the snow, families, no heat, no icebox, no nothing. You're living in a flippin' tent. And so she's able to get a whopping 24 apartments built for African American workers with the support of the great labor leader Walter Reuther, who I will come back to in a minute. When the African American families arrive to move into this in Detroit, they're met with people with pickaxes, 1-inch lead pipes wrapped in barbed wire, and rifles, military weapons. They cannot move in. They go back and they have to go to their tents. Meanwhile, the next year, the families are ultimately able to move in. But there's a young African American boy who's at a park in the middle of the river. And he's got an inner tube. And he floats over the invisible line. We have the worst race riot in our history. We have to drop stun bombs on New York. It is white on black violence. Eleanor is blamed for the riot by both the New York Times and the Mississippi and the Detroit press because she has been so vocal in trying to help get the apartments built. So FDR finally sends her out of the country because she very much wanted to go to the Pacific Front. The front. To write about the courage of our military personnel in the Pacific, the way that Ernie Pyle was writing about our military personnel in the Atlantic. So she flies in unpressurized military aircraft. You know how you're in a plane and your ears pop? That's pressure. Imagine what it's like if there's no pressure. She goes deaf in one ear. She gets there and she walks, in 2 days, she walks 50 miles of hospital corridors. Her feet, one of her arches falls. She will have to wear special shoes for the rest of her life. She goes to every person by the bed, introduces herself, says, where are you from? Talks to them about, something in their town that she's seen. She takes notes, and she goes back so that she can, in fact, do their last requests when she returns home. She starts to carry a prayer in her wallet. Dear Lord, lest I continue in my complacent ways, help me to remember that somewhere someone died for me today. If there be war, help me to remember to ask and to answer, am I worth dying for? She sees African American military personnel who cannot receive plasma that they need to stay alive because it was plasma that was derived from a Caucasian's blood. It is a felony that strips you of your voting rights, of credit, of employment, if in fact you give the person of one race plasma that was taken from another race, even though plasma was developed by an African American physician. We know that she goes into operations. We know that she gives people cover. And so she comes back home more determined than ever to say to America, we are all on trial to show what democracy means. So when Franklin dies, as the war draws to an end, she comes here to Hyde Park, to Valkill. They're going to give the big house to the government. She's bitterly disappointed, not just because her husband is no longer able to guide certain folks through the crisis, but she's bitterly disappointed that she's not at the founding meeting of the United Nations, because they were going to reunite and take a cross-country train trip together to go to the founding of the UN in the San Francisco Conference. Eleanor had been intimately involved in the planning of the UN. And if any male historian tells you she wasn't, tell him to grow up, know how to do research, look at how people hide their tracks, look at Stettinius's papers, look at the UN papers, look at papers in British archives, and also look at papers in Latin archives, all of whom are in correspondence with Eleanor about the creation of the United Nations. She is a flipping player. So when she's in Hyde Park, people come and make pilgrimages to her, Will you run for this? Will you be president of this university? Will you take this cabinet position? And she says no. She says, you need not worry, my voice will not be silent. Meanwhile, she's corresponding with Stettinius, our Secretary of State, and other members of the American delegation. Fast forward. Truman doesn't know what he's doing for 6 months. He doesn't give him hell Harry, until 1947, 1948. He's clueless in the first 6 months. So she's quiet for a while, and then he makes a series of contradictory moves, and she says, okay, I've had it. So Eleanor begins to speak out publicly and travel the country trying to hold Truman accountable. Truman then sends Eleanor to join the first American delegation to the United Nations to get her out of the country. Not, she's Mrs. Franklin Roosevelt, but she's going around saying he doesn't know how to do his job. So at first she turns him down, then she goes back. I'm going to do this really fast. Refugees are the major issue at the early days of the UN. The boys, as she calls them, want to say who's going to control the bomb and who's going to be on the Security Council. Meanwhile, you have conservatively between 30 and 60 million refugees in Europe. That is 30 to 60 times the number that are there now. You don't know where the boundaries stop. It was a ground war. Europe is in shatters. So the first major fight in the General Assembly is who's going to control the refugees. And none of the men on the American delegation are thinking about this. And so when Vyshinsky, the greatest Soviet debater, won't take no for an answer, raises it in the General Assembly, who does the American delegation turn to out-argue Vyshinsky? Eleanor. She out-debates him so well it's on the front page of Pravda in the Soviet Union. So the world at the UN then comes to her and says, we want you to chair the commission to draft an international covenant on human rights. At that point, there are 51 member nations of the United Nations. 50 are absolutely united, convinced she has to do it. Who's the one that doesn't want her? Us! They say, oh my God, she's going to talk about health care. Oh my God, she's going to do all these social issues. What the hell does she know about diplomacy? Well, to make a very long story short, she holds 300 meetings in 2.5 years that last over 3,000 hours. Out of that comes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So why was she so adamant? Every member on that committee was a lawyer, a philosopher. She had 4 years of school. But what did she know? She knew the religions of the world. She was conversant with the world, and she knew how to get inside their head. Marie Souvest. You must know the position of your fiercest critic as well as your own so that you can move it forward. Eleanor makes a very fateful decision. She says that we can't get a covenant in 3 years, so we're going to work on 3 things simultaneously. We're going to get a declaration, we're going to get a legally binding treaty or a covenant, and we're going to work on an international human rights court. She says if we try to get the covenant in 3 years, it'll never work because lawyers spend 3 years arguing over where to put a comma. But the thing that is remarkable about this is Article 1. It was the last article that was created. It was the one that everybody fought over. And it's this: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. It is the first time in the history of the world that we have men, women, and children of all races, all nationalities, all respected as people under the law. Now, you may say, well, man, this is just too dumb for words. Okay, let me do this. There are 18 people on her first committee. They don't agree on God. They don't agree if God exists. They don't agree if there's one God or 5 gods. They don't agree if they're private property. They don't agree on the purpose of government. They don't agree on marriage. They don't agree on citizenship. They don't agree on business. They don't agree on anything except they beat the Germans. I'm serious, honest to God, that's the only thing they agree on. And so what she has got to do is negotiate with all of them, all of their governments, who, by the way, would pluck them out and put somebody in their place if they didn't think that they were representing their government enough. And then she had to make it clear. So to do this, she met with every member of the United Nations staff. She met with the cooks, the drivers, the clerics, as well as the lawyers and the diplomats. It was her greatest life work. It is now the model for more constitutions and more bills of rights and more governments than our own Constitution and our own Bill of Rights. And she pushed, because she got into this, she pushed the Soviets not to abstain on civil liberties. And she went to George Marshall and John Lovett and said to them, if you don't support this, I'm going to resign. And I'm going to tell you why. Because the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to education are the most basic, fundamental human rights. If you go to bed thinking you're going to wake up starving, or if you go to bed and you feel like you're going to get killed in the middle of the night, fear will overcome you. Democracy is based on hope. It's based on dreams. It's not based on nightmares. So who does she get to go with her? John Foster Dulles, which is sort of like me walking into the White House with Steve Bannon. And what does she say to him? You are Catholic. You are Jesuit. Your whole life has been with the Catholic fellowships. This is your faith. She wins him over. So you have one of the most conservative hawks in the Senate going in to argue for food, shelter, and education. So she comes back to the United States and says, where, after all, do fundamental human rights begin? They begin in small places so close to home they don't show up on any map of the world. Without concerted citizen action, they will disappear. She debates the American Bar Association. She works with young people. She works with clergy. She works with labor to begin a conversation that says fear will destroy the American dream. We have risked our lives, our money, our hope, and our family to defeat fascism. We cannot turn away the way we turned away in World War I. So, as she goes into the last years of her life, she identifies very much with women who are trying to advance through the ranks of labor, with young people who are risking themselves to change segregation, and with Americans who are beginning to take individual acts on their own. Individual acts to speak up in class. Individual acts to take a friend to the hospital. For people going to different denominations. For different races next to each other. In 1960, she browbeats John Kennedy into coming to a civil rights conference in October in Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, where John Kennedy promises to ban federal discrimination in housing with one stroke of the pen. She has refused to endorse him until he does that. Against the advice of his advisors, he goes to New York, he goes to the conference, he says this. Eleanor then goes on a 16-day, 5-city tour for him, because she has said to him, you're really weak on civil rights. He had a horrible record in the Senate. He took one vote, and that was to weaken the Civil Rights Act of 1960. He abstains on everything else. And she says, and Bobby was horrible on labor. So if you're going to win, you got to prop those up. Where does she go? African American churches, Urban League meetings, NAACP meetings, labor halls, all over Illinois, all over California, all in Atlanta, Wisconsin. Let me just give you one statistic. John Kennedy became president because he got 225,000 more votes in Illinois. I'm sorry, 225,000 votes across the country than Richard Nixon. In Illinois, where Eleanor camped out, he got 242,000 African American votes. And 6 weeks before that, Daddy King Sr. had endorsed Richard Nixon. So there's an Eleanor here that we don't know, that we're just beginning to unpack. And what I know, what I have learned from her, from reading thousands and thousands of letters to her, some that are in Hyde Park, some that were never sent and are in other people's personal correspondence. She saw every day how democracy didn't work. She saw its shortcomings every day. But she never gave up on it. Why? Not just because she was stubborn, not just because she was a woman of faith, but because of the people that she met who made democracy great. Eleanor stays alive to write Tomorrow Is Now for the young people in this room. She says, you are the ones who have the courage. We are tired. We love you. We will stand with you. I have given you all I am. But it is your turn to lead. But you have to lead smart. You have to build coalitions. Compromise is good, Eleanor says, as long as you compromise up. If you sit and do nothing, you are a coward. Witness the title that we gave tonight's talk. Staying aloof is not a solution, she writes, with the last sentence she will ever write, other than a thank you note to Jacqueline Kennedy. It is a cowardly evasion. So if we are unready, it is up to us to get off our butts and figure out how to have the conversations and risk ourselves. Because it is the risk that makes us leaders, and it is the collective risk that gives rise to greatness. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And if you're just doing it for midterms, you can go home. It's okay. Oh, thank you. I'm serious, you can go. If you want to stay, I'm happy to talk.
Well, not really a question, but I thought I'd make a comment. You may not realize that you're standing in about the same spot Eleanor was when she spoke here. Of course, not in this building. This building is newer than that, but the building was here before that. She came and spoke to the student body here. I met her then.
Well, I hope I'm not struck dead by getting something wrong. Well, thank you. I mean, I don't want to make you sit if you don't want to. Okay, have fun, everybody. But I'm telling you, Eleanor would say, if we don't figure out how to stand up to one another in a way that is not expletive-filled, says this trash mouth, but in a way that will bring us forward, we're not only crushing us, we're crushing the world. And I want you to think about that. You know, I want you to think about what people are going through right now. Not just jobs, not just the fight for health care, not just the fires in California, not just the ravage of Puerto Rico or Houston, you know, or New Orleans, bless its heart. But look at South Korea. Eleanor got that. And women around the world understand that much more than we do at home. Which is why there are more schools named for Eleanor Roosevelt around the world, modern schools in post-conflict countries, than there are in the United States. I mean, I was in the favelas in Brazil about 15 years ago. And, you know, with my 30 words of Portuguese, bastardized Portuguese, you know. And this woman asked me why I'm here, and I gave this really dipshit answer, you know. And I just said, well, that's not wrong. I said, you know, I really work on Eleanor Roosevelt. And she would haunt me if we didn't have a conversation. This woman could not tell me who the president of Brazil was. She had never heard of Nelson Mandela. She had never heard of Princess Diana. She had never heard of Mother Teresa. But she knew Eleanor Roosevelt. And she knew Eleanor Roosevelt would do three things: school, safe place to live, and food for her children. If a woman in the favelas of Sao Paulo knows this and takes courage from her, and we don't, shame on us.